If you're looking to better understand the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, a great resource is Bruce Hoffman, who's one of the leading experts on terrorism here in the United States and has been for some time. And he recently put together an article with Jacob Ware titled Israel's 9/11, How Hamas Terrorist Attacks Will Change the Middle East. And this was published in War on the Rocks on October 10th, 2023. In the article, Hoffman says that perhaps the most surprising part of Hamas's devastating cross-border attack was its complexity. Rarely in history has a terrorist organization been able to fight from the air, sea, and land. And this is an argument that Hoffman, I believe, has put forward before, I've at least heard it before, that these terrorist organizations are so much more now, or can be. And Hezbollah is one of the examples that people often point to, where it's not just, a terrorist organization as we think of like Al-Qaeda or even Islamic State in a sense, but there's more of a state actor component with how sophisticated some of them have become. And we saw this recently during the Hamas attacks into Israel. They say that with terrorist groups as far afield as Afghanistan pledging to support Hamas, the introduction of a diverse array of foreign fighters cannot be discounted either. Now, there was early on, right, when this fighting kicked off, the Taliban said that they would like to march on Israel. Not very realistic, kind of out of character for the Taliban. They've got their hands full just trying to maintain control over their country. And again, the Taliban is a relatively local regional movement. They're very focused on Afghanistan, not so much the larger Islamic causes. Now, one thing this brings to mind is something I always thought was interesting when studying terrorism at West Point, and it was that Israel makes for an easy target in terms of throwing threats out there into the wild. What I mean by that is any jihadi group, even when there's fractures and division within some of those organizations, any one of them can throw out, we want to attack Israel, we hate Israel, whatever it might be, and that kind of mobilizes people behind you, right? That's a common cause for so many of these jihadi groups when otherwise they might sometimes beat each other's throats. So not crazy to hear that groups all around the world are kind of speaking out on behalf of Hamas and celebrating what they've done. The authors say that in terms of population proportions, this conflict will be much worse than the attacks suffered by the United States on September 11th. In the first day alone, it is the equivalent of if 20,000 Americans had been killed on 9/11. Adding these recent events will forever change the security calculus of Israel and assuring the safety of its population. Now, I bring this up not as a everything is about America sense like that. Now, the majority of the viewers here are American, and I think it's valuable to put it in terms we might be able to somewhat relate to. Just under 3,000 Americans were killed on September 11th, 2001. And if you were alive, if you remember the public sentiment after that, it was everybody on board, go get them, find these guys. We have to get revenge and bring to justice the people who did this horrible thing. It's hard to imagine what the feeling would have been like if it was, 7 times that. But based off of population proportions, that's the effect being felt across Israel right now. So when you see some of the commentary of people saying we have to go in there and end Hamas forever, completely eradicate this organization, if you think back 20 plus years in the United States, I can understand where that emotion is coming from. The authors then say that this situation was arguably foretold 35 years ago in Hamas's covenant. Reading from that covenant, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. Now, quickly, I think everybody recognizes this, but we just have to hammer this home. Hamas does not represent all Palestinians in Gaza. They don't. They do have support, but there's a difference between the organization that is Hamas and the Palestinian people, and then there's a difference between Hamas and some of these extreme views and all of Islam. Right, so we cannot make those mistakes. We cannot group everybody together like that. But something that comes to mind when I see this is an old line of when somebody tells you who they are, believe them. And we've seen some of this play out in other conflicts, in major wars throughout history, where after the fact we look back and we say, they told us they were going to do that. They said what their intentions were, and we found ways to write it off or to say they didn't mean that or it's being misinterpreted. And I think that's a risk here in the United States when it comes to terrorism. I think one of the reasons, when we look at a lot of these groups and say they don't have the capabilities to do that. Islamic State has largely been confined to the Middle East and Africa for some time now. They haven't carried out large-scale attacks in the United States. Terrorism as a conversation has kind of fallen off the radar. This might bring it back into focus, recognizing that some of these groups very much do have capabilities that they've developed over the last few decades that they might not have had when 9/11 first occurred. They say many commentators have rightly decried the attack as terrorism, which it is. If you look at just the base definition of terrorism, which is the unlawful use of violence against civilians for political purposes, that is exactly what we saw. So it's not trying to shift the narrative or place labels on this. That is the definition of terrorism. They say, but the reports of indiscriminate executions of civilians, sexual crimes, and the young, old, and disabled being dragged into captivity make even that pejorative label inadequate. Instead, clearer language is needed when civilians are treated like this. Pogroms, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and perhaps even crimes against humanity may thus be more accurate. And to take this back, it's impossible to have an understanding of how either side truly feels in this conflict, not having lived through it, not being a part of that, of course. But again, trying to think of how I felt on 9/11. I was a sophomore in high school when that happened. And the attacks, the nature of those attacks, flying airplanes into buildings, it wasn't a specific. It didn't feel like the 9/11 hijackers, Al-Qaeda was targeting specific Americans. They were targeting America, right? In a way, all of us. But the way that we've seen some of the images and the videos come out from these last few days in Israel, they're very personal attacks, hand-to-hand combat, right? Killing people with your own two hands. The emotions are going to be strong, understandably so, right? It's very, very, very personal. They say what is less clear right now is how Hamas hopes the next days will unfold, which is a valid question. What is Hamas hoping to get out of this? Because they had to have believed and recognized that Israel would not just sit down after this, right? There's going to be a response. They say perhaps Hamas is attempting to provoke an overwhelming response, as Al-Qaeda did on September 11th, inspiring both Palestinians and their allies in Lebanon and beyond to attack Israel. So what he's getting at is one of the arguments that Al-Qaeda used in the attacks on 9/11 was not that the United States would just wither away and die after those planes hit the towers, but the idea that our response would not be calculated. It'd be emotional and overwhelming and would in turn, right out the gate, kill a lot of Muslims. And that would kind of help the Al-Qaeda cause. It would pull people into their cause to say, yes, we need to join up against the Americans wherever they might be. So the idea here is maybe that's what Hamas is doing. But they push back on that, saying it seems inevitable that the attacks will only set back the Palestinian cause, perhaps fatally. This may yet prove then a stunning miscalculation and perhaps one only made possible among actors blinded by hate. And part of what they're getting at here is all of the footage that has been captured of the recent attack into Israel. It's one thing to attack military or police forces, things like that, but some of the just brutal violence being inflicted upon civilians, men, women, and children, like you're going to have inevitably some of the always anti-Israel groups support that and be in favor of it. You're going to have some of the extreme Hamas supporters support that, but any groups that are on the fence, I don't know that this level of violence is going to bring them into Hamas's corner. Like they said, it might have been a decision purely fueled by hate. Then in terms of what this could mean going forward, the authors say that Israel may thus feel driven to target the group's enablers in Iran rather than the individual terrorist movements directly attacking it from three directions. Three directions here potentially being Gaza, the West Bank, and then Hezbollah in the north out of Lebanon. They say the allure of dealing such a knockout blow will be difficult for the Israeli leadership to resist given the right-wing composition of this particular ruling coalition, but it would unleash powerful forces that would likely prove impossible to control and would certainly engulf the entire region. And I understand the desire, as Israel is sitting here, wanting to not just remove the terrorist threat that is Hamas, but look to who facilitated them, who allowed them to exist, who is funding them, and that is largely Iran. Now, I've mentioned in a previous video, maybe this will change any moment now, but I haven't seen clear-cut evidence that Iran directed or helped coordinate this attack. There's been mixed reports on that for sure, but at the very least, there is an ongoing, very healthy relationship between Hamas and Iran. But again, put yourself in the position of the people and the politicians in Israel. There's going to be an understandable call to just wipe this thing out forever, and that would That would be Iran. It wouldn't just be Hamas, wouldn't just be Hezbollah. But as the authors rightly point out, that is a long, bloody, complicated war. And in wrapping up, they say, if anything approaching the worst case scenario, a full-scale, full-theater, total war in the Middle East involving Israel defending itself against Iran and its proxies comes to fruition, the security and stability of the world will be affected in ways that would eclipse the impact of the 9/11 attacks 22 years ago. And I think that's worth drilling home. Just, we don't know how far this can spiral. We're so early in this, but it has the possibility. I think it's so easy to look at this and think of this as just a domestic dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, or specifically Israel and Hamas, and maybe Lebanon, right? But that's not the case, especially when you get into Iran and their proxies all across the Middle East and the number of targets they could strike and just how this could quickly spiral and pull in other countries that we're not even mentioning right now. That has to be on the radar in the coming days, weeks, and months. And hopefully there are countries all around the world stepping in to try to prevent that from happening. This is already bad enough, right? We don't need additional escalation through the Middle East anytime soon. But that's all I got for now. Again, I will link this article as well as where you can find Bruce Hoffman and Jacob Ware in the description below, along with the national security sit reps I put out on Substack. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.